Hello, this is the Nebraska Broadcasting History Project, a series of video interviews with those who have most impacted the Nebraska broadcasting industry. We are here at the television studios at UNO. I'm Jim Rose. It's great to have you here. Pioneer is exactly the term that you'd first use to describe Earl May. A Nebraska native, he launched a seed and nursery company that still opens its doors today. Seems about the time Mr. May first heard something live on the radio, he was sure it would be a great fit. And so it was that launched a 50-year legacy of May broadcasting in Nebraska. And we are joined by his grandson, Ed May. Ed, welcome.
Thank you, Jim. It's great to be here.
Tell us about your granddad. What do you remember most about him?
Well, he was, as you just said, he was an entrepreneur. He liked, he was kind of a showman, so I think the broadcasting thing fit well for him. And he had the seed and nursery business, which at that time basically was a seed catalog. And also he had some stores in Shenandoah, Iowa, and I think the second one was in Lincoln. And he wanted to promote his products, and this new thing called radio sounded like the way to do it. So he would lease time on some stations here in Omaha, and I believe KFOR for a while in Lincoln. And then he decided, why don't I do my own thing? And so on August 12th of 1925, he started KMA in Shenandoah. And so that was our entry into the broadcast business, and he broadcast regularly on the station himself. And he died, unfortunately, at age 58 in 1947. But he knew that television wasn't too far down the line, and that was the next thing. But had a full life. He crammed a lot in 58 years.
What was he like on the air? As you talked to your dad, who obviously heard him on the air, and those who remember the Earl May garden centers and the Earl May programming, what was he like? Was he a kind of a hard sales guy? Was he a likable entertainer kind of guy? What was his style?
He was probably more entertaining, although when he got into serious news, he would that side of him would go away. For example, he went to San Francisco and covered the initial forming of the United Nations, so that was a serious thing that he enjoyed doing, and he filed reports on that. But he also incorporated the showman in that he would have organized once a year jubilees in Shenandoah. And at that time, they didn't have the entertainment that we have today. And so people would come to Shenandoah for free pancakes and lots of entertainment, of which he was usually in the middle of. He would bring dignitaries to town, usually politicians and others. And they'd get, in a week, they'd have 100,000 people come to this thing. And so he enjoyed that kind of thing. So he was, I think, a personable, really enjoyed communicating with people. So a bit of a showman, I guess, is the way to describe his style.
Many of those early local broadcasting pioneers were also performers. They'd play music. Most of the music and entertainment in the day was performed live by local musicians. Some of them grew to great fame across the country. Did he perform on the radio too?
He did not perform on the air. He was not a musician, but he was the headmaster of a program called the Country School every day in the afternoon, Monday through Friday. So, and it was a bunch of corny things that they did on the air. I think my dad equated it to a kind of a early radio version of Hee Haw, the old television show. And so he was a performer, but not a musical performer in that regard.
But he loved to sell products, and it was the beginning of what really made local broadcasting what it became. It's designed to promote local businesses, local products, and right at the top was the Earl May Seed Company.
Yes, he did that. He was always kind of looking for the next opportunity to promote, and he had started to expand the stores. So I mentioned that Lincoln was the second store, and these at that time they were garden centers, yes, but they were also, because of the times, they were kind of a general store. So he would sublease the men's clothing department to the local person that had a clothing store in Shenandoah or whatever. And you could buy tires there, you could buy baby chicks there, you name it, they could kind of sell it, I think. And he was always on the radio promoting all those particular items.
So the store really was an extension of his brand.
Yes.
People were buying stuff because they needed it, but they really wanted to come in and see Mr. May.
That's correct. That's correct.
Now, your dad was right there at the beginning, and the family still owns KMA in Shenandoah today.
That's correct. Yes, we do. And we're in our 93rd year, it'll be 94 in August. and been blessed with a lot of great people that have come through there over the years, and we have a wonderful staff today. I feel very fortunate.
That's a source of great pride. It must be for you, even though your family about 30 or so years ago really got out of the broadcasting business full-time. To have that one station as a signature for your family must bring great pride.
Great pride. I think we have a lot of history, obviously, and we're try to ingrain ourselves into the fabric of rural America and southwest Iowa, northwest Missouri, southeast Nebraska. So we do a lot of local things, from sports to news to farm, you name it. If anything moves of any significance in that part of the world, we're hopefully covering it.
Well, now you worked at the radio station, the TV station when you were growing up. How about your kids? Any of them caught the broadcasting bug?
No, I've tried to introduce them, but nobody has taken the interest in it yet. My son, youngest son, I think he was in 8th grade, and they had a job shadowing day, as they do in many schools, and so he went with me to the station, and we have a show. It's a buy and trade show called the Elephant Shop. And so he got to announce the name of the caller, and then the host would take it from there. So that was, at least the next generation got a little bit of on-air experience, but I think that may be it.
So radio was working well for the May family, and then at the World's Fair in 1948, somebody said, hey, you got to check out this TV deal.
Right.
Talk about how TV worked its way into the gene strain and the DNA of the May family.
Well, it was, as you said, Jim, they went to the World's Fair and saw some demonstrations of television, and were very interested. And Dad said it seemed like the next logical progression from radio. And so, as new as it was, and so in 1948, the Federal Communications Commission had issued 2 licenses to Omaha. One was Channel 3, one was Channel 6. And so our family applied and was fortunate enough to receive one of those 2. Meredith Corporation got the other. We had Channel 3, they had Channel 6. And so several of the people who worked in Shenandoah at KMA came up here and started building the KMTV facilities, and 2615 Farnham Street. And I think they kind of had to make it up as they went along, because really this was brand new and nobody really knew what they were doing. But there was a wonderful engineer by the name of Raymond Sawyer, and he had been in Shenandoah for many years, and he came up and he kind of was instrumental in making that happen. And a gentleman named Owen Sadler, who had been running KMA, came up here and became the general manager of KMTV and put it on the air. So really KMA fed the personnel, the initial personnel that really started KMTV, and it was signed on in September 1st of 1949.
Kind of a risk. You know, radio guys know how to do radio stuff. They know how to make sound come over a giant stick. But television, pictures, lights, there must have been a headache of problems putting that thing on the air.
There were, and Dad always said that once television became successful, everybody said, oh, it must be really easy. And he said, in 1949, he said, we felt a little bit like we were taking the dice and rolling it and throwing it, because it was very unproven. No one had television sets at home. I mean, it was, and that's another thing. They had to promote television, people to go out and buy televisions, because if you don't have a TV and nobody's watching your programming. So he said it was, there were some nervous times, but then it started to get some traction, and they kind of had to figure it out, though, as I mentioned earlier. The networks didn't have the volume of programming in the early days that they do today, so there was a lot of live programming. They didn't have the taping capabilities, so there's a lot of live commercials, and they kind of had to figure it out as they went along. News was the same way. So
your grandfather was really the radio pioneer, and your dad was really the TV pioneer. How did he get into this, other than a wonder, because it was new and it was fast growing, but the 1940s and 50s were different. It took off in the 1960s, but through the 1950s, there were no programming consultants. You couldn't copy what somebody was doing in San Francisco because they weren't doing it yet either.
Right.
What do you recall about your dad building the station's content and its sales pitch?
Well, I think, Jim, that Owen Sadler, I mentioned him earlier, he was instrumental in this. And he was a very bright man, and he was able to really start surrounding himself with some really good people, as it turned out, that some of which went on to have some tremendous careers nationally in the business. But we were just always blessed, I think, as Dad would say, with a lot of really good people that again, just does it make sense locally? I mean, what can we do? You were very localized in everything you did because you didn't have the network, at least to the degree they do today. I mean, at that time, I'm not sure the network was doing any television news, and if you recall, when they did start dipping their toe into television news, they only did 15 minutes a day. That was it. So you had to kind of fill everything, and I think, again, it was very hyper-local and trying to figure out all kinds of things you may not do today and aren't done today probably.
And the station wasn't on 24 hours either. They would sign off at night. Folks would turn off their TV at 10 o'clock and that would be it. No Johnny Carson in the beginning.
That's correct. That's correct.
But the radio was still a big part of the May broadcasting portfolio and eventually became one of the biggest players in Nebraska radio because you purchased KFAB, which at the time was the #1 station in the state, the biggest signal, and had the greatest audience. Talk about how you didn't rob Peter to pay Paul, how you were able to meld these two organizations and these two different mediums together without competing with each other.
Well, as Dad would tell the story, sometimes it's better to be lucky than good because KFAB, in a way, was a little bit of a defensive play. In those days, very early, this would have been in the 1950s, early to mid-50s, the radio networks still were very powerful, and they still had, not all the stars that were on network radio back then had transitioned into television. So it was important to have a good network affiliation in radio as well as television. And so we were, Channel 3 was NBC, and KFAB was an NBC radio affiliate. And Channel 7 was slated to come on the air, and this again I think was 56, 57, somewhere in there, and they were really not having an opportunity to have a strong television network because we had NBC, Channel 6 had CBS, and Dumont at the time was really nothing. It eventually rolled into ABC and became something, but that was years later. So you did not want to lose your network television affiliation. So the theory was, let's get involved with KFAB. It's a good operation, and they had that NBC radio network. We'll pair that with the NBC television network we have over here, and we should have a stronghold in both. And fortunately, there were people like Lyle Bremser and Ken Hedrick and some wonderful people at KFAB that made that station so immensely successful, and we were fortunate to be a part of it.
Your dad took over leadership at Channel 3. How much did he interact with the folks at KFAB? Once he was running the television station, which is clearly a full-time job, and you were not in the same place. KFAB was in a different part of town, and later KGOR, their FM station, and you still had that operation down in Shenandoah too. How did he manage to balance managing the organization in so many different ways?
Well, again, like any organization, it's good people. That's really the name of the game. And Lyle Bremser and Ken Hedrick were doing such a good job at KFAB, you didn't really have to worry too much about it. So there we had regular meetings and some board meetings, but really there was just, it was delegated. And so if you tried to micromanage Lyle Bremser, that wasn't going to work. First of all, he was so good at what he did, it didn't matter, and you would make a big mistake doing it. He'd get frustrated. So really, it was delegated, Jim, and so that's again another wonderful part of the relationship. In fact, my parents and the Bremsers grew to be very good friends, and my mother and Betty Bremser, both at 98, are still good friends. So it was a great relationship all the way around, business and personal.
Lyle once said he really discouraged his radio people from ever doing television, and in particular television commercials, because Lyle's attitude was, the guy at home knows what you look like in his mind, and you're bound to disappoint him if you go on television. Was there any pressure internally or externally to utilize the very high-profile personalities that KFAB had in the marketplace to benefit the television product?
No, I think they were very separately run in that regard. There was not a lot of crossover. There might have been some news coverage periodically that would be a benefit to one or another, but they were very autonomous in my recollection of it.
So let's talk about some of these people. On the radio, Lyle was one of the truly iconic voices in Nebraska for years, and not just because of football, but he was also the track announcer at Exarban for years, and many believe that actually was his calling, that he was better calling the races at Exarban than anything else. But yeah, he was also the general manager of the radio station, and he and Ken Hedrick programmed it for years, and right up until the late 1980s, KFAB was the #1 rated radio station in the country by objective measure. What about this guy? What do you remember about this guy, and what was he like? You were a younger guy, but
Right.
The relationship, everybody has an ego, the relationship between your dad and the senior leadership of the organization and Mr. Bremser.
Well, what I remember of it is the fact that, again, it was very respectful. My father was the type of individual that he was a people person. He really liked being around people and relating to people. That was one of his skill sets, I would say. And so, again, I think that he and Lyle were on the same page, so to speak, from a management philosophy standpoint. And so he let Lyle do it. And they talked regularly, but they didn't get into each other's business. I mean, when you have something that was running as well as KFAB, you really would, the worst thing you could do is try to interject yourself too much into something that's really going well. And Dad was smart enough to know that this is going really well, let's just let it happen. Let's stay on top of what's going on, but let him do it.
And don't mess with the soup. It tastes pretty good now.
Absolutely.
Walt Kavanaugh was the most respected. He was the Walter Cronkite of Nebraska broadcasting, the longtime news anchor at KFAB. Turned down numerous opportunities to become a national network voice. This guy had tremendous autonomy. And today, often management gets into content and says you need to do it this way or that way. I can't imagine anybody going to Walt and saying, you know, you really ought to do it this way. Have you thought about doing it that way?
I can't either.
And yet egos, everybody's got one. And today often senior leadership is sometimes envious of the following that its on-air people have. That must have never been the case when your dad and your grandfather ran the organization.
No, it really wasn't. And also I think part of it too, Jim, is, you know, it was a different time than it is today. And so I think that I don't know if there was a little more leeway to be able to do certain things. It's a much more structured industry today than it was at that time, in many ways, in my opinion. And so, you know, it was a little different era. But yeah, to go in and tell Walt, you know, I'm sorry, Walt, it's been great, but you need to do it this way now, would have been an absolute disaster.
Especially about the time he's delivering school closing information when 99% of the audience was listening.
Right.
It must have been a different time too, and as observing your dad, I suspect that, and from what I've gathered, in those early days of television and in radio's really terrific golden age of the 30s, 40s, and 50s, that senior leadership took great pride in developing stars on the air. They would not necessarily take credit, but they'd appreciate if one of their people really rose through the ranks. Was that the approach that your dad and your grandfather had?
Absolutely, absolutely. We were very fortunate. KMA, for example, back in the live radio days, there was you had all these staff musicians because they played music all the time to help fill the time and entertain, of course, too. And there was a gentleman that came to work at KMA by the name of Ike Everly. And Ike had two sons, young sons, that came with him that are now in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, the Everly brothers. And they were on the radio. In fact, we still have a recording of them of Christmas morning 1946. One was 9 and one was 6, and they were singing Christmas carols on the radio. And we still have that recording. But again, it was to get the best talent. And years later, when I was working at Channel 3, and I think we lost someone to, I believe they went to Seattle, a news anchor or something. I don't remember the exact circumstances. And I was a little flustered, and I told my dad, I said, gee, Merry Christmas, you know, he was really good, and you hate to lose him. And he said, always remember, it's much better to have people that other people want than to have people that nobody wants. And that was a learning lesson for me right there.
And you were seen as a great minor league organization for major markets. Hey, if somebody can go from Channel 3 to New York, Chicago, or Seattle, it must be a great place.
Absolutely. We wish them well, and thanks for your service here, and good luck to you.
And don't be afraid to come back if you need a gig down the road.
Absolutely.
You see the same people going up that you see coming down. To television, Tom Brokaw. Not his first television gig was Channel 3, but one of his first television gigs. What do you remember about Tom?
Well, of course, I was not at the station at the time, but the people tell me that he was very hardworking, very industrious. Interesting little tidbit about Tom. Apparently, when he came, he had a little bit of a speech impediment, and he had trouble with double L's. And so the news director at the time, Mark Atier, found someone at UNO to help him with a little speech. And so they worked together, and he solved that. Well, years later, as Tom had a tremendous rise in the business, he was very, very good, obviously, at what he did. He signed on with the Today Show, and he started working there in the 1970s. And his contract was $1 million a year, which is a lot of money today, and it was really a lot of money back then. So the news director, still Mark Atier, wrote him a congratulatory note. And apparently he got a note back from Tom that said, "Thank you for your help, and I now can say 1 million."
With no trouble.
With no problem.
Well, legend has it that Roger Larson, the late broadcasting executive in Lincoln, who is as respected in Lincoln as your father and grandfather were across the state, had a chance to hire Tom Brokaw as a news anchor at KFOR in Lincoln. And he said to Tom, he goes, "You're a good-looking guy, you got a great voice, but that speech impediment, not going to work on the air, but we'll take you in sales." And Tom says, "Well, I think I'll give this on-air thing a little bit of a shot." Roger was kind of sensitive about that for years, but then he started laughing about
I know,
it.
I had the good fortune of working with Roger for a while, but I never heard that story. I wish I had.
He didn't tell it a lot.
I can understand why.
He didn't just go around town bragging about how he couldn't identify Tom Brokaw as an on-air guy. Floyd Kalber, another great, highly respected Nebraska broadcaster who went on to great things out of Channel 3.
Yes, he is an Omaha native, graduated from Benson High School with my father-in-law. They knew each other their entire lives. And he started at KMTV, and really that's a time when Floyd started again. There really weren't any rules in the business because no one knew exactly. You kind of made it up a little bit as you went along. And so Floyd was an excellent journalist. He appreciated hardcore news. He was not a lot of fluff and happy stories. He was the news is serious business, and we're going to treat it as such. And he was very talented, very good guy. And I remember years ago, or years later, at a KMTV reunion that I went to, he was telling the story about in the very early days, they had 8mm film cameras that they would go out, these little Bell and Howell cameras that they'd go out and film news stories, but there was not any audio, so you had to write separate copy for the audio and record it, and then somehow try to sync the video and the audio together when you played it over the air. And they figured out in the newsroom, there's a distance, they marked 2 marks on the floor, and they were so many feet apart, and they would wind the developed news film around this, and they were Santa flush cans. And so they would wind them around the Santa flush cans, and they knew so many times around equaled so many seconds, and that's how they would take the audio and sync it with the video. So things have changed just a little bit. But Floyd was a fabulous guy and did a wonderful job, and really, I think, cementing KMTV as a serious news station in the 1950s. And then he went off to Chicago, had a tremendous career in Chicago, went off to New York and did the Today Show inserts in the Today Show in the 70s, about at the same time that Brokaw was there. And then he ended up going back to Chicago and finishing his career there as, again, very successful news anchor.
Another one is Chuck Roberts. Tremendously popular in Omaha in the 1970s, was willing to risk that to jump into cable television news and stayed for years.
That's one when you mentioned earlier, Jim, about, you lose somebody and you feel bad about it and what have you, but really wish Chuck well. I really liked Chuck. I had the opportunity to work with him some, and he was a great guy. He was a very good newsman. He really kind of had a sense and a nose for news. I thought he had good presence on the air, obviously, which served very well. So he started in headline news, I believe, at the first anchor they hired at CNN when it started He was there for, I don't know, 20 or 25 years, I'm not sure, but till not long ago. But he was tremendous, had a lot of credentials. He was also the fastest typer I've ever seen with 2 fingers. My gosh, he could make that typewriter just smoke.
And he didn't have automatic correct, and he didn't have backspace. You just had to know what you were doing.
He just had an electric typewriter.
Yeah, they really were better back then than they are now. How about Dale Hansen? Dale Hansen, super popular sportscaster for you, went on to Dallas, but kind of a mercurial personality.
Yes, he was. He was at the station, and actually, for a while, he was the number 2 sports person, and then worked into the number 1 slot. And Dale did a really good job, but he then had an opportunity to move to Dallas. And when he moved to Dallas, things just exploded for him down there, and he did remarkably well. So he did a good job while he was at KMTV, and we were happy to have him, and we were happy to see the success that he had in Dallas, which was immense.
He actually became famous in Dallas because it's a pro sports market with the Cowboys and the NBA and Major League Baseball. But nobody had been doing much with high school sports in Dallas until he came along and said, look, I can't out-cowboy the Cowboys. These other guys have all these contacts with the pro teams. Why don't we do something that everybody loves in Texas but nobody spends a whole lot of time covering? And that was high school football. And he actually did late-night high school football highlight shows, and they were immensely popular and elevated his place.
Very
he was
perceptive.
also best known as the guy who broke the SMU NCAA pay-for-play scandal. Did you sense that he had that kind of journalistic bent when he was at Channel 3?
No, I think is the short answer on that. And in fact, I'd not heard that story, to be honest with you. So good for him. That's a tremendous accomplishment. And he was very perceptive to see the opportunity that high school sports, and particularly football sports in Texas, presented. I'm surprised no one else was doing it, but good for him for taking it on.
They started after suddenly they're looking at the ratings and he's beating Johnny Carson in Dallas on Friday nights, and they're going, maybe we should do more high school football coverage around here.
Very
what
good.
do you mean? I'm about the NBA. Not anymore. Now you're about the high school football teams. Nynette Beaver was one of the early women news reporters in Omaha television. Talk about her career.
Nynette really broke the glass ceiling, so to speak, on women in news. And so in the in the 1950s, I don't remember the exact year, she was working at KMTV in the news department. And then there was some mass killings for Charles Starkweather. And this was down in the Lincoln area. Some murders took place in Lincoln and some outside of Lincoln. And there was hysteria. I remember seeing newsreels, a film of parents with shotguns at school doors. I mean, there was really panic in the area. And as it turned out, once they caught Starkweather, he was accompanied by his girlfriend, Carol Ann Fugate. And she was younger than he was, about 14, I think, at the time. And so she had to go through a trial and everything as well. Nynette developed a very close relationship with her, and she trusted Nynette, and Nynette earned her trust. And NBC was very interested. We were an NBC affiliate. NBC was very interested in this story. So we would feed, Nynette would feed stories back to the network too about the Charles Starkweather as well as Fugate trial and all the aftermath. And I think Nynette stayed close to Fugate for the rest of her life. And Nynette worked in the news department for many, many years, assignment editor for a while, and she was a little bit of a jack of all trades. So yeah, she really was a pioneer.
When you were involved heavily with the stations in the 70s, Ed, did you see pushback from some of the grizzled veteran guys when you saw this new wave of women that got into television news? That was when they sort of began to take their place, and it wasn't easy for them, and they probably didn't get a whole lot of great assignments, but they kept pushing and pushing. How was that culture at KMTV during that time?
I don't know what it was prior to my arrival there, but when I didn't observe anything that was an issue. In fact, while I was there, I remember we had a female news director for a while. And so, yeah, I don't think that was a problem. I think it was, and maybe in retrospect, maybe they had to prove themselves just a little bit more at that point in time. But there were many very capable people there that Roseanne Shannon, I've heard her name mentioned in this project, and she was certainly one of them. She was as good as anybody.
So this May broadcasting conglomerate kept growing a little bit here and there. Not crazy, it was the ownership rules that restricted some of that. But eventually a television station in Wisconsin, a television station in Arizona, and of course KMTV, and then in Omaha, KFAB and KGOR, the top rated stations. Then you get to the mid-1980s and you sat around and said, do we want to keep doing this? And what played into the decision for the Mays largely to get out of the broadcasting business? Keep KMA in Shenandoah, but everything else went. What went into that decision?
Well, a pivotal point in that was my dad's decision to retire. And so that was part of it. Family business was another part of it, and there were a number of family members, and like myself, that were in the broadcast business as well as the seed and nursery business. The garden center business, I mentioned earlier that the seed and nursery business early on was kind of a general store concept. That evolved in the 50s and 60s into garden centers. So there were at that time 63 garden centers in 5 states. So that had grown into a meaningful company, and there were other family members involved in that. So it was a generational thing. We were the 3rd generation, and decide, what's best long term? Where are your interests? Where are my interests? So as a family, from both sides of the family, my aunt's side of the family as well as my dad's side of the family, we said, there was a point in time where there was a little bit of a frothy market to sell properties, and we just said, okay, collectively, let's sell these things, and we'll hang on to KMA. And then my aunt's family, who had been in Shenandoah involved in the seed company, we sold our interest in that to them. So it was several different decisions, family basically, and I had taken a look with my father briefly to see if there's a way that we could purchase the television stations and maybe KFAB and keep it in our side of the family. But as I mentioned, the multiples were so high, it was prohibitively expensive. So it just made more sense to do what we did.
But you didn't completely get out of it forever. You kept KMA in Shenandoah, and then later in the 1990s, you rescued KFOR in Lincoln from conglomerate ownership. And talking to KFOR people that I know, Ed, that was some of the best times that those young broadcasters had, because they had been involved in being associated with non-broadcasters who got into the business because of its financial strength. But you came back and said, I love this local radio station. So for a brief time, you were in Lincoln broadcasting.
That's right. And I had the good fortune of that's when I worked with Roger Larson, who was a great guy. I have a tremendous amount of respect for Roger. He was great. And my only regret with KFOR was Roger wasn't about 15 years younger, because he retired 3 or 4 years after we had purchased it. So, but it was a good experience. We had a lot of good people there, a great heritage. KFOR and KFRX were well thought of in the community, so that was an important component in the decision to buy it and looking at it, and just tried to maintain that. How close and how much interest did you have since then, in the last 20 years? Has there been any close calls of getting back in? There have been economic sways in the business sometimes. There's a good time to buy and a good time to sell. Yeah. Ever come close to getting back in beyond just KMA in the last 20 years? Oh, I've looked at it a couple of different times. There were a couple of different situations that presented themselves. But, when you don't have all that debt, you sleep better at night. And so I thought the sleep factor kind of won out.
So it was all about your sleep, Ed, is that what you're saying?
Yes.
So you've shortchanged the entire industry just so you could get 8 good hours of sleep.
Not sure if I shortchanged the industry, but that would have added a lot of pressure, probably at the point in my life where I really didn't want it.
As you look back and say, hey, the industry has evolved in a way that maybe I'm not as good with the way it is now as the way it was when my family ran it. Maybe the local impact isn't the same because of conglomerated ownership. We just don't have as much of an impact locally as we once did. Do you find yourself sort of thinking, they're just not doing it right, let me at this for 6 months, I'll show you how to do it. Do you ever have any of that Saturday or Monday morning quarterback, Saturday night quarterbacking, Monday morning quarterbacking?
Well, I I'm not sure I could do it any better than anybody else is doing it, but I would have to say, in all honesty, just speaking for myself, that I always really gravitated a little more to radio, and so I love being a part of KMA and that tradition, and I do miss KFAB and KGR. I do miss that. That would have been fun to be a part of, but it wasn't meant to be.
If your grandfather was here today and he saw how the internet has impacted the radio business, what would he think of the industry today? Would he be as optimistic and as excited about it, as bullish on it today as he was back in 1929?
I would think so. You have to adapt to change. That's obvious. In all of our lives, change is ever present, and it's certainly rapid change in today's media world. I would think that given his track record, that he probably would have found a way to embrace it. I really do. And that's just apparently the kind of person he was. So I wouldn't be the least bit surprised if he would have jumped in. I don't know if it would be successful or not, but he'd get in the mix.
Good chance, because he'd probably say, I'm not getting in unless we have good local leadership. You know, Owen Sadlers and Roger Larsons and Lyle Bremsers.
Yeah, that's the key.
Right. Well, today we've learned of a remarkable family-owned business that has truly blazed a trail in Nebraska broadcasting. Our history is enriched because of the May family, and our thanks to Ed May. This is a production of UNO TV. For the Nebraska Broadcasters Association and for Ed May, this is Jim Rose. Have a great day.